A world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations.
If you're looking for the real help, babybar.online.
Hello everybody, this is the BP Learned Hand with FYLSE Real Help to Pass the Baby Bar. I have had a few requests to do a torts overview and outline, so that's what we're going to be covering today. So torts and your torts outline is very similar to Legos. There's only one way you can stack it. And if you don't stack it the right way, then you're going to miss important issues and you're not going to be discussing them in the order they need to be discussed. So just like you cannot have a standard of care discussion after proximate cause, you do not want to be talking about negligence per se before you've gone into your duty analysis. So here you can see we've got our negligence, our duty, our breach, our causation and damages, but it's never that simple because underneath each of these Legos essentially are more Legos, the smaller Legos, right? So remember, when you sit down in your essay, you should spend 15 minutes going to the call, reading the call, looking at your fact pattern, issue spotting, and then putting your outline down. And I know that that can feel a little intimidating, but it really shouldn't be that difficult. And when people say things like you need to practice your outlines, you need to get your outlines down, this is what they're talking about. So say, for instance, we sat down, we looked at our call of our question, we realized that we were in negligence, and the call of the question said, what is Bob's liability in negligence? Right? That was the call of the question. We would throw our call of our question down, and then we would take this time to go read our fact pattern and to look for those specific issues. When we were done, what we would come back and we would do is we would write down our elements: duty, breach, causation, and damages. Now remember how we were talking about those smaller Legos that go underneath everything else? You know, the little tiny ones, like you can see on the left side of the screen, there's a little tiny green one, a little red one, a little yellow one. Well, this is where we're gonna put our little tiny Legos. So under our duty, we have our standard of care. And then under our breach, we have our negligence per se. We have our res ipsa, if there happens to be any, falling cows from the sky. We're going to have our failure to act as a reasonable, prudent person. Under causation, we're going to have our actual, and we're going to have our proximate. And then under your damages, you're going to have your general damages and maybe some punitive, if you see that. So I know everybody's looking at this going, well, that's way too easy. That's super easy. Okay. Well, let's take it in even a little bit further. Let's drill in a little bit more, right? So we know our heading is negligence. We know that we need to establish a duty, right? And that by establishing a duty, we're identifying the standard of care that must be identified. So duty is going to be one of our headings because it's one of our main umbrellas. Next is breach, and we know that breach can be shown through negligence per se. Remember, this is if there's a statute. Res ipsa is always when you don't know the cause. No idea. And I generally say this is the falling cow. Falling cow. You have a cow falling out of the sky, or you have a bucket flying out of a window, or you have something coming from, coming from the heavens, right? If you're not in a negligence per se, and you're not in a res ipsa, then breach is shown through that failure to act as a reasonable, prudent person. And in some situations, in some fact patterns, it's just that simple. The standard of care was the, general duty to act as a reasonable, prudent person, and they failed to act that way. Sometimes it's not that easy. Sometimes you have to get into the learned hand. And in your learned hand discussion, remember, this is also sometimes called your social utility discussion. You want to look at the social utility of the activity. Extent of injury, burden, credibility. This is the kind of stuff you want to get into. Now remember, we're going through layer at a time, so stick with me here. So next we have causation. We have our actual cause and we have our proximate cause here. And so we know that our actual cause is our but for, right? But for the defendant doing something, someone wouldn't be hurt, right? And then our proximate cause is our foreseeability test, right? Was this foreseeable? And then we get into damages, which are generally pretty straightforward. You know, the guy was in a car accident and now he has medical bills. Well, those would be general damages. You know, if this was shown through intent or any type of malice, then the potential for recovering under punitive damages would be there. But this is the giant 5,000-mile view of your outline. This is just the, all right, put it down on paper and go with it. So now let's take it even a step further, right? Let's take it one more step. Let's drill in a little bit more. So now we have a new page up. I've shrunk the font a little bit so we can go ahead and kind of beef this out a little bit. So negligence. Under negligence, if you're like me, you kind of feel like you have to have this essay looking a little cleaner than this. So generally what I do is I'll put my negligence statement right here. So all right. So as you can see, it's a pretty long-winded sentence. Sometimes if you look at the model answers, it's as simple as saying, in order to show the prima facie case for negligence, you must establish there was a duty, a breach of that duty, actual and proximate cause, damages, and no valid defenses. This is the 2 million word version of exactly what I just said. You can write it as big as this, or like I said, you can put it in your own words and just say prima facie case for negligence is shown through, you know, there being a duty, the breach of that duty, which caused damages with no defenses. It can be that simple. And the only thing you have to remember is just keep your elements in there. As long as your rule statement is accurate and it has the elements, then it's fine. And this is why you'll hear so many of your professors say, there's no one way to write a rule statement. Now, here we are under duty. Now, the way you start your duty sentence is up to you. The way I've always written mine is, the general rule of duty is there is no duty. And the reason why I always write my rule statement as the general rule of duty is there is no duty unless there's an affirmative act or a special relationship is because I personally always like to get into my discussion on Cardozo and then on the Paul's graph case. And so when I start out my rule statement with the general rule of duty like this, then what this does is this allows me to clearly show the graders that I know that I need to establish a special relationship or I need to establish a standard of care here. And then it gets me points for bringing up Andrews and Cardozo. So here I put down my general rule of duty, right? And then I will put down that so the general rule of duty is there is no duty unless there's a special relationship, and that under Cardozo view, the defendant owes a duty to only foreseeable plaintiffs. And more minority view was seen in Andrews, where everyone owes a duty to the world at large. So here what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to have this discussion. You're going to want to put your rule statement down. You're going to want to, And since I really don't have any kind of hypothetical, we're going to just take standard of care out here, right? Because we've established our duty and we don't really need to put standard of care. And you'll see with your outline, that's something that'll happen a lot. There's going to be things in your outline that aren't necessarily going to apply to the essay you're writing. So now under breach, we're going to want to do the same thing that we did above. We're going to want to go and we're going to start writing our rule statement. The defendant breaches the duty to the plaintiff if he fails to conduct himself as a reasonable, prudent person in the same or similar circumstances. If there's a statute in the fact pattern, then we're going to be looking at our negligence per se, right? And we remember the injury caused by the defendant's conduct is the type which the statute was intended to protect against. Plaintiff was a member of the class intended to be protected, and the violation of the statute was not excused. Those are those three requirements. And we would have those discussions in our negligence per se statute right here if this were an issue, right? So we would discuss that the injury caused that the plaintiff was a member of the class to be protected, and that these violation is not excused. So as you can see, we just kind of build, you know, as you're writing your outline, as you're going through, as you're identifying issues in your fact pattern, you're going to build on these different issues. So we're going to take out res ipsa here. We're going to take out our failure to act as a reasonable, prudent person, because we've already gotten our breach statement here. We've got our negligence per se statute here. And this can be turned into a sentence, by the way. I just wanted to break it down for you. And then we have our learned hand discussion. So let's flesh our learned hand out a little bit. All right, so let's go ahead and put down our BP learned hand. So if the burden of taking precautions is less than the probability of injury times the severity plus social utility, then the D breached his duty by not taking those precautions. BRECAU. Now, the learned hand formula is something that I have always had a hard time remembering. So it is always something that I constantly put in my outline and that I'm constantly remembering to bring up. This is why I tell you guys, these are your outlines. They're very much independent and they're made for you and they're made to help guide you and to help remind you of what you're supposed to be doing, what discussions you're supposed to be having, and they're supposed to be there to trigger your memory. So now we've got our rule statement down for that. Now let's move into the next. Let's move into causation. So in causation, we have our actual and our proximate cause. So let's go ahead and let's get our statement down under actual cause, because we can't just leave it like actual, right? We can't just leave it but for. That would be kind of silly. So let's put this here. All right, so this is how we do our rule statement for but for. Or, you know, you can just say something as simple as the defendant's conduct was the but for of the, you know, plaintiff's injury. I mean, it's really, like I said a million times, it's how you want to write it. These are your rule statements. Either how you remember them. Now is not the time to be trying to learn a rule statement all over in a different way, right? This is not that time. So here, I think a lot of people get concerned because we're going to have our actual cause. We're going to do our but-for test, right? But then also under this actual cause, we also have a substantial factor, right? We're really not going to want to bring up substantial factor unless there are two or more defendants that are bringing injury to the plaintiff. And this will allow you to do a substantial factor analysis. So remember that a defendant's conduct is the cause and fact of the plaintiff's injury if that conduct was a substantial factor in bringing about the injury. And so I don't know if you want to give yourself a little note here or kind of give yourself a little memory thing, or I don't know, but you may want to put 2 or more defendants for your substantial factor. Otherwise, it's going to be a single sentence, and you're going to put your sentence down, and you're going to be like, here there was only Bob, and then you're going to move on. Now, next, what we have is we have our legal, our proximate cause, right? It's whatever you're going to call it, whether you're going to call it your legal or you're going to call it your proximate. I memorized it at proximate, so that's kind of what I'll always call it. Okay, so let's do proximate cause. So proximate, remember, this is our foreseeability. So if a reasonable person would have anticipated the extent and type, of injury by the D's risk creating conduct, the P's injury was foreseeable. I am the worst speller today. Thank goodness for spell check, right? All right, so then this was foreseeable. And so now we have our rule statement here. We know that the test we're going to use is the foreseeability test, right? So let's go ahead and let's make sure that we move this down a little bit so we actually have space here. There we go. And then finally we have our general damages and our punitive damages. And once again, remember, those are just pretty generalized. General damages depends on your fact pattern. Do you have medical bills? Do you have pain and suffering? In punitive damage, do you have, can you show intent? Is there some kind of malice that you can show in these activities? So I know that there's a lot of things that are missing from here, and I know a lot of you are going to be like, well, what about this and what about that? So, just kidding. Let's go ahead and let's drill in even more. Let's go in a little bit further. All right, since we're drilling down a little bit, let's get back into duty. Okay, so you have your duty to care for the plaintiff, right? And then you have your duty to control. And then your duty to warn. So under your duty to care for the plaintiff, this is when the D has a duty to take affirmative action to benefit the plaintiff where there exists a special relationship between the D and the P from which the D derives economic, benefits. So this situation, this is, like we said earlier, this is going to be your employer, your employee relationship. That's going to be this one. This is going to be your employee. This is going to be your student teacher. Now remember, try to keep this separated between negligent hiring, because negligent hiring is also one of those special relationships, right? And so in our, let's underline this so we know where we are here. I want to lose place, right? There's nothing worse than losing where you are in your outline. So our duty control. So in our duty to control, here what we're going to have is that the D has a duty to take affirmative action. Notice how the duty to care for the plaintiff and the duty to control, these are all very similar the way they're working here. To protect the plaintiff, where the D has a special relationship with a third person that gives the D power to control the behavior. So this is probably most likely going to be recognized to you guys in the situation of like a parent-child, when you're controlling the behavior. It can also be that employee-employer. I mean, if you have an unruly employee, it can also be, the same as it was in the first one. It can also be a student or a teacher. It can be, a joint enterprise. Remember that? The joint enterprise, going out and drinking with your friends and creating a joint enterprise. The one that commonly comes up here under this duty to control others is this negligent hiring. So we're just going to put this here because this one is often one that I have seen. So the defendant, as the employer, we're going to put this in little marks here, has a duty to the P to exercise reasonable care in hiring employees. So this means that, if you're operating a daycare center, you have a duty, right, to exercise reasonable care in hiring your employees. So you're not hiring sex offenders or murderers or things like that, and that's where you're going to have this discussion. That's where this discussion comes in. It comes in under your duty. Now, the last one is this duty to warn. I'm sure you guys remember that really confusing case that we read in 1L about the psychotherapist-patient relationship. Well, in some jurisdictions, and it's not in all of them, but in some, a defendant who has a requisite special relationship with a third person who becomes aware that that person intends to do harm to somebody, they have a duty to warn. So remember, this is just one of those like minor ones. The only reason I'm putting it in here is because I know at this point a lot of you are really worried about your outlines and what they look like, and so I'm going to make sure that we're getting down just about everything we can. So now we're back into breach again. So let's ease into all of our breach of duty discussions by starting with something pretty common to everybody. Common carriers, right? Now, common carriers were traditionally said to have a duty to avoid harm to their passengers through the exercise of like the highest degree of care. So I'm going to put common carriers here, but then I'm also going to put in parentheses, I'm going to put innkeepers and utility. We're going to put that there because it has shown up on essays before. So we're going to write here that common carriers and that would be the discussion that we would have if we were working with, let's see, common carriers could be bus drivers, trolley drivers, things like that. And so that's our common carrier. Let's take one more step in and let's go into our, more likely than not, our doctors, right? Our doctors or our surgeons or, our architects, right? We have a professional level, right? We know that here, what we want to say is that this person has the duty to act as a reasonable person, possessing the customary level of specialized knowledge and expertise of a practitioner in good standing of the same or similar trade or profession as the defendant. So this is where you will hear a lot of professors say, a reasonable doctor standard. So if you're working in we're going to put practitioner here. If you're working with a practitioner, what we want to say when we're talking about this practitioner's breach of the duty is if this practitioner did not act as a reasonable doctor standard. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to write so this is your reasonable doctor standard, right? Because it has to, remember, your reasonable person standard doesn't change. It just changes to a reasonable doctor standard. Okay, so now into what everybody dreads and hates. So now let's get into the most fun part ever, trespassers, right? So we know that a trespasser is if the plaintiff enters into the defendant's land without permission, right, or without a privilege to do so. Defendant has no duty to warn for unknown trespassers. If we have frequent known trespassers, then what we have here is if the D knows let's go ahead and clean this up a bit. So that's our frequent or known trespassers, which is different than our child trespassers. So you're going to want to keep that in mind as well. So now let's go ahead and let's attack child trespassers, right? So child trespassers. So with child trespassers, there is the duty to exercise reasonable care and possibly to warn of known dangers. But remember, this child trespasser issue, you know, this kind of gets into your attractive nuisance. So anytime you start getting into child trespasser, you're really going to want to look at your fact pattern, and you're going to want to try and identify what type of child trespasser you're looking at. Now we have our licensee. Now remember, a person who enters the defendant's land with the defendant's express or implied permission, but who doesn't enter for the purpose of benefiting, is a licensee. This is your social guest. This is like inviting your friend over. So let's put our rule statement here. Is a person who enters onto the D's land here. What we have is we have the D has a duty to exercise reasonable care to protect from injury arising from the activities conducted by the D or on the defendant's behalf. Now let's get into our invitee. Give me a second, let me clean up my work here. All right, so in invitee, we have our business invitee, and then we also have our public invitee, right? So with our business invitee, what we have here is we have an invitee who enters into the defendant's land for the purpose related to the defendant's activities, right? So customers, people who work in one building with everybody, you know, that kind of thing. And then we have our public invitee, right? And our public invitee is a member of the public who comes to the land, you know, like if you're holding a concert or, you know, something along that lines. So what we have here is we have the duty to exercise reasonable care to prevent injury you know, like filling in holes. If you have a punji pit on your land and you can warn people, but you're going to have a bunch of little kids running around, you know, just putting up a warning sign isn't going to be sufficient for a small child. So you may have the duty to fill that in. Now remember, with your landlord-tenant, the landlord has a duty to upkeep the common areas, right? These common areas include if you have a bunch of apartments and there's a pod in the middle, a common area in the middle with a TV, then that's the landlord's duty. If you're in a building and there's an elevator then generally that elevator belongs to the landlord, and it's the landlord's responsibility to upkeep there. So now that we've gotten all of those terrifying invitees, trespasser issues taken care of, now let's get into our causation. So we have our actual, our but for, we went through that. One of the things that falls into our actual causation discussion could be Summers versus Tice, but remember, Summers versus Tice isn't very commonly tested, and neither is your market share liability. So we're not going to get into those. Now, next we have is our legal proximate cause, which we've pretty much covered. We have the foreseeability test, but the one thing that we haven't brought in here yet is the fact that what if this is not an unforeseeable injury? So what if a reasonable person would not have anticipated that the injury would result as the defendant's conduct? So then what we have to do is we have to look a little bit further into this proximate cause and the foreseeability test. And this is where you're going to have your eggshell plaintiff discussion. So here in our eggshell plaintiff discussion, we're going to have that discussion on if a reasonable person would have foreseen the defendant's conduct threatened the type of injury suffered, but would not have anticipated the extent the defendant's conduct is still the legal cause of injury. This is the eggshell plaintiff. You take the plaintiff as you find him. So when you're doing your foreseeability test and a reasonable person I know a lot of people have had a hard time trying to figure out where they have this discussion because we all remember him. We're just not necessarily sure where this guy goes, right? Well, this is where this discussion happens. Now, I know we all remember our polemis and our wagon mound and things like that, but this is, so if you're not an eggshell plaintiff, then if you could not have foreseen that the conduct threatened the type of injury, that's when you're going to get into your polemis. So remember, your eggshell plaintiff is that the type of injury was foreseeable, but the extent wasn't. So throwing a baseball and hitting somebody in the head, you're expecting a head injury. But to cave in this guy's skull, that's an extent of that injury that you just wouldn't foresee, right? But if you're in this situation where the type of injury, right, that was not foreseeable. So this is where we have our polemis jurisdiction, right? And if you guys remember polemis is when they were doing that. There was that boat, and they were unloading this wood, and they knocked something down, and it caught the whole boat on fire. And it's just kind of one of those injuries where you wouldn't expect that damage to have happened. It wasn't the extent, but it was the type, right? The type of damage. So it's immaterial that the nature of the injury was unforeseeable versus in polemis. So polemis, we're going to write that. Because remember, the whole point of getting into your proximate discussion is because you want to keep liability limited, right? This is that, can we sue Charles Manson's mother for the murders that he committed? Well, we have to cut liability somewhere. And so this is kind of where we want to go with this. Now, there's also our superseding intervening discussion that we have to have here. And a force is described, it's explained as intervening when a force combines with the defendant's conduct if it arises after the conduct has begun. So that's important because you have to remember it's happening after the conduct has begun, not before, but after. So sources of intervening causes can come from other people, not just the defendant and the plaintiff, right? It comes from animals. It can come from nature. I believe there's an essay where there's a zebra who comes into play. That's an animal. Those can be intervening forces. Once you get into whether or not there's an intervening force, Then you have to decide whether you're working with a dependent intervening force or an independent intervening force, right? So we have our dependent and we have our independent intervening force, right? So with our dependent intervening force, it's one that arises in response to the action, you know, and the defendant is liable if the defendant intervening force is normal or foreseeable. So once again, we get back into that foreseeability issue. So if you're in proximate cause, you have an intervening force, right? This is something that happens after the defendant's conduct's begun. Once again, we're looking at the fact of whether it was foreseeable. Is it normal or foreseeable? So remember, we want to keep the foreseeability of it, foreseeable, and then it has to be normal. So these are rescues, negligence, medical treatment, and suicide. Now, we also have our independent, right? And our independent is going to come when we have something along the lines negligence of a third party, illness, accident. So an independent intervening force is one doesn't arise in response to the defendant's breach of duty. These are reasonably and foreseeably, but they do not supersede the defendant's negligence, right? So we're going to put here, once again, reasonably, foreseeably. And these are going to be things like negligence of a third party, illness, accident. All right, let me clean this up here. All right, so if you've gotten that far, we've gone through this incredibly crazy outline so far. And we go through damages. Damages are pretty standard, you know, once again. But we also have our defenses. And I saved our defenses for last because they should be relatively quick for you to get through. So remember, we're always going to have our contributory negligence. We're going to have our comparative negligence. Oh my spelling is atrocious today. We're also going to have our assumption of the risk. And what we're going to have to do here is we're going to have to discuss our contributive negligence and our comparative negligence, right? Because we all remember that, am I writing negligee? That is horrible. Negligence. In contributory negligence, remember, you're required to exercise due care to protect yourself, right? And at common law, if you were found to be contributory negligent, this was a complete bar to your recovery. So what we're going to do here is we're going to put our rule statement down that under common law, now, these days, under comparative negligence, which a majority of people, a majority of jurisdictions follow now, is that there's an apportionment of risk, right? Now, once you get into comparative negligence, remember there's different types of comparative negligence jurisdictions, right? So we can have our pure comparative negligence and our partial comparative negligence. So this one, we're going to use 99% and 1% kind of as our rule statement, kind of as our explanation here. And then here for this one, we're going to do that 51%. And then once you get into assumption of a risk, remember you have to knowingly, voluntarily appreciate the risk and then subject yourself to that risk. And so that's it. That is your giant outline. That's how you begin to put your giant outline together and how you begin to walk through your giant negligence outline. Remember, there's only one way to do this analysis, and you always have to start at the top with negligence, and then you have to walk your way down. Duty, breach, causation, and damages. That'll do it for us today. We look forward to seeing you guys. Good luck on your FYLSC.